Good afternoon, everybody. We have Jess Lukas here, who is a Senior Vice President of Commercial Development at BDSA, joining us on the next episode of our podcast, Cannabis Unlocked. Jess, we'd love to welcome you to the channel, welcome you to the podcast. Very glad to have you.
Thank you. Excited to be here today.
Thanks, Jess. And what would be great, I think, is at the start here, if you could tell us just a little bit about yourself, how you got to BDSA, your prior career, and a little bit about the company as well would be great.
Perfect. So I spent most of my career within consumer packaged good, beverage, alcohol, market research and marketing. So working with some of the largest brands and players, especially on innovation and innovation success. I've now been at BDSA for over 4 years, which I think is eternity in this industry. The difference of where we were when I started a company in 2017 of 20 employees to where we are now is a completely different space. And I always like to comment on, it's very difficult, obviously, to be at a growing company, going through the stages of a startup, but to layer in also a growing industry. And the growth and the sophistication of our client base as well, it's like 3 levels of craziness over the last 4 years.
Sure.
Where we were 4 years ago was honestly, in a lot of cases, convincing the mainstream consumer packaged good, beverage, alcohol companies and tobacco companies that cannabis is real. And it is a real business that will be sophisticated and essentially another CPG category or industry. Within cannabis, 4 years ago, we were trying to convince retailers and brands, manufacturers and cultivators that they in fact should use data to drive their decisions. And we had to argue why data is valuable. So completely different market today than where we were 4 years ago.
Yeah, no, I bet. And we got into cannabis space about 3 years ago as well. And it's certainly a night and day difference from the early days in Colorado in particular. It's to jump right into some interesting questions here. As someone like yourself, very close to the data in all different states across the U.S. and in Canada in the cannabis space, what are some of the most interesting developments and changes you're seeing day to day? You work with a lot of different clients, a lot of different brands, like I said, across the nation, and it's very different state to state.
Yeah, definitely. So just for those who do not understand or know BDSA, just to kind of level set, we are the go-to market research cannabinoid data company in the industry globally. We are predicting out 5 years by state, by province, by category, by channel being medical, adult use, and illicit, as well as in 38 countries globally, where we anticipate the legal and illicit markets to be out to 2026. So macro market forecasting and sizing, helpful for total addressable market sizing for a lot of our clients and partners. We can then drill in to specific states or provinces into who is consuming, who is not consuming, and who are these people consuming demographically, psychographically, what do they consume, why do they consume, need states, and so on. And then what we're most well known for is actually tracking day-to-day sales. What is selling, let's say ingestibles to edibles to gummies, edibles to candy to gummies to wild to wild Marionberry, 100 milligrams THC, indica as your SKU. What is selling where, when, at what price point across markets in the US, and then through a partnership with Hi-Fire in Canada as well. So kind of full comprehensive coverage of future market forecasting, in-depth understanding of the who and the why, and then also actually tracking what's selling at what price point. So big loaded question on what are those trends.
Yeah.
I would say, it's always fun to start with the consumer side of it.
Okay.
What we've seen in the last year is a significant growth in the percent of the population across all US states consuming cannabis. And so why it's important to say all US states, we are seeing significant growth in the percent of adults consuming in Florida, a medical only market. We're seeing the percent of adults consuming in Illinois or Massachusetts, newer adult use markets growing. And we're even seeing those growth rates in the most mature markets like Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and California. So even in markets that have been open, thinking about Colorado going back to January 2014, whoa, I almost spaced and said 2016, January 2014, we're still seeing the penetration, the percent of adults consuming growing. So not surprising then, as more people are consuming, you're seeing greater sales. So you're still seeing those mainstream kind of core markets growing year over year.
Sure.
And then those newer markets coming online as well. So just to call out, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and California, we're now at almost 50% of adults consuming cannabis. Compare that to beverage alcohol, 60 to 70%. We're not that far away. That is night and day what we saw 4 years ago. Even in Colorado, 2017, only 25% adults were consuming. So from 25 to 50%, really big jumps. So again, just the general population acceptance, and not just acceptance, but actual growing.
And I'm sure part of that is just, we're having, I think, a big destigmatization of cannabis. I think people are seeing all these different form factors come on. You have people who use cannabis in the illicit market and still use it now in a legal market. But you also have, I think, a lot of people who come and say, maybe I didn't want to smoke flower, but now maybe I'll have THC tea, maybe I'll eat some type of edible, one of the millions of different products out there, state to state.
Completely. And you don't see consumers exclusively consuming one specific format. So even if you look at consumers who prefer inhalables or specifically prefer dabbable concentrates, a majority of those people are also consuming via flower, some sort of flower method, or your point, edibles, or even topicals. And all of a sudden you start understanding, dependent on the functional benefits or the experience they're seeking, or who they're around, or what type of what day part it is, you start seeing different choice sets emerge. And so now all of a sudden, people might wake up and take a hit off a vape pen, get through the morning and maybe have a pill that is a THC infused product. And then all of a sudden you start seeing different behaviors emerge. And also, growth in the population consuming, but guess what? People are consuming more product form factors than they ever have before. And they're also consuming more frequently. And we saw that jump in COVID. I don't think that's super surprising, but people are at home. And so consumption throughout the day, every day, grew even more. So I love to call this out, that 70% of inhalable consumers across legal states are consuming cannabis at least daily. So as we think about the population consuming growing, as I mentioned, about 50% of adults now in those most mature markets. And then you unpack and say a big portion of those people consuming inhalables, and most of those consuming at least daily. This isn't just a once a week, once every few weeks, or every couple of days. This is kind of a part of their day-to-day routine. And that's something we've seen for some time, but that percent of people kind of utilizing the products every single day is definitely growing as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting for sure. And those numbers are honestly staggering. I couldn't have guessed that if you told me. But, to think even a market like Colorado or even, there's been less of a stigma in Colorado just culturally. But to say, in 2015 or 2016, 25% cannabis was legal, but 25% of the population was using it, and now it's 50 plus. And I think you said you expect to see that in other states as well, if you already have not.
Yeah, and that's interesting. If we think about 40, so the actual numbers, because I memorize a lot of numbers, 47% of adults in Colorado are now cannabis consumers. Already in Michigan's at 44% of adults consuming cannabis. So the newer markets that come online, they don't look like Colorado in 2014 or 2017. They look like Colorado today. So to your point, that like cultural destigmatization, yes, happened faster in the markets that legalized earlier, but that's kind of just spreading across the total
US. Nationwide.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's super interesting. Thanks, Jess. To jump ahead here, a few other things I thought we could chat about. What are some of the differences you see, I'd say, across state markets? I mean, one thing we talk about all the time at Key Investment Partners, and I think a lot of people in cannabis talk about, is just how different it is, whether it's from an investment standpoint or whether you're an MSO or a branded product. What is the difference between some of the older state markets and some of the newer markets? And, if you're scaling a brand, what are some of the different ways people are doing that successfully? I know there's all different kinds of models.
Yeah, I mean, to talk to the first question, some key differences, the way regulations are set state by state kind of determines how those markets grow over time. So, you look at Colorado, California, Oregon, Washington. I even throw in Michigan to some degree, just given their history of this caregiver market that's been in place for some time. You've kind of got this like deep history of how the market became what
Sure.
it is. So let me use an example just to compare two states that couldn't be more different. And I actually pulled up the numbers, but if we look at Illinois, there are 79 unique brands in Illinois and about 2,600 unique SKUs. SKU could be a strain for a flower product. A SKU could be a specific live resin vape cartridge. A SKU could be, a pack of gummies with specific counts, specific flavors for a specific brand. So again, 79 brands and about 2,600 unique SKUs.
Okay.
California has 760 brands and 24,000 SKUs.
Okay.
So,
wow. So
put in perspective, like how markets emerge. And obviously California might not be a good example because it's so big. It is the largest global legal cannabis market. It's just a massive market. But even if you compare that to Colorado, again, 80 brands in Illinois versus 250 brands in Colorado. That is a huge difference in terms of the fragmented nature and how the market emerged and grew with kind of independent retailers and independent brands over time versus Illinois, a very much MSO dominant marketplace. You have Curaleaf, Cresco, GTI, Verano, PharmaCann, Ascend Wellness. You have key players who are dominating both the retail landscape and the brands. So they're competing with one another, and they're also having to wholesale their brands into each other's stores. It's just a very different marketplace. And I think that's really interesting to unpack of how are you successful in a market like California? If you are not if you are used to a vertically integrated, very corporate dominated market, how do you move into California and be successful? And the flip is also true. If you're a very dominant, strong brand in California, how do you move into a market like Illinois or Massachusetts, which is much more consolidated in nature?
And that's super interesting. And so do you see, I'm curious, you have so many in California, cannabis is notorious for being very difficult, to start and successfully run a branded product. It's hyper competitive. It's a huge state. Do you see branded products who look at a market like Illinois or Chicago and say, I'm just going to avoid that market. I want to expand into a different market because it's just simply dominated by some of the bigger players, and they don't think they have as good of a chance there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you see it both ways. I think you see some players being like, okay, unless I partner or license with one of those larger operators, how do I really succeed in getting distribution? And how do I really succeed in that space? You also see some of those dominant corporate players looking at California and looking at it and saying, without retail, without this vertical integration, how do I succeed here? How do I force out these brands that have kind of risen to the top? And is it worth how much I'm going to have to spend in getting shelf space, in getting promotional activity, and getting bud tenders to push my product? Is it worth the investment? And can I kick out a top 5 brand? And I think that's a really interesting situation on both sides. I'll call out, you look at a brand like Wild, and Wild is #1 in Oregon, moved into California, has been very successful, rising to the top, has moved into Colorado, has been very successful. So it's not that it's not possible, but it doesn't, it's not that it's not a challenge either as you think about it. And, you look across the US and you look at some core players, and they do have different strategies. A Wild is moving market to market and building the infrastructure they need to succeed in each state. A brand like Wana is utilizing licensed partners state by state. A great example is looking at Illinois and saying, okay, Kiva is with Cresco, Wana is with Curaleaf, GTI Green Thumb bought Incredibles, like they're pulling brands into the state, and
Sure.
that's another path. And then obviously you have your M&A activity happening across the map. Bigger players, whether it's brands buying brands, we've seen some interesting cultivators buying brands and retailers buying brands. I mean,
Sure.
the day-to-day announcements, and obviously you're keeping track of that too, are there isn't a one size fits all solution.
No, definitely not. And that's very interesting. It's oftentimes I think it's probably the if you think of all the challenges in cannabis, right? Interstate commerce and that being prohibited, it is probably up there at the very top of challenges for cannabis companies. It's as if you're doing business, I often say, in several different countries. It's just almost night and day how different they are. So it's interesting to hear that. And on that point, we obviously saw Schumer come out with this new legislation. A lot of people are asking questions about that. How serious is it? We don't see a huge chance of that bill being passed, as I think a lot of people familiar with the matter would certainly agree with that. How do you guys, when you guys at BDS are doing forecasting, right? How do you think about forecasting and bake in all the uncertainties with federal legalization and everything going on in Washington? What is your opinion on legalization? When are we going to see that? I'm sure it's a question you get a lot, as do I.
Yeah. So as we think about the dartboard that is predicting state by state what happens in the loosening of regulations from an illicit market to a restricted medical to a more open medical to a fully adult use legal. There again, back to there is no one size fits all. Obviously, we saw this year Arizona pass and essentially become an adult use market overnight. That looks very different than other markets that takes years to set up. And so we're always having to assess what is the landscape in that state? What's the infrastructure that's been set up? And what do we anticipate happening in terms of licenses being released? And what is that licensing process? How long is it going to take to be an operator? Obviously, you have to start cultivation to be able to have product to then sell in an operating retailer. And obviously, definitely been a supply and demand mismatch in a lot of markets that have opened up. But as we look at it, we're constantly making predictions of what does federal legalization mean, but also what does state by state legalization look like over the next 5 years. We don't anticipate, just like you, as it stands right now, the Schumer bill, I guess we could call it discussion draft, to pass. I think there's some interesting components on it, and it's definitely going to accelerate conversations, but it's not going to stand as is. Even with federal legalization, and this draft bill says the same thing, even with federal legalization, our stance is it's state by state. It's not we go federally legal and everything turns on and interstate commerce is available. Right. Very much federal legalization might accelerate state by state legalization, but it's still going to be state by state as it's been for the last decade. And that's really important to call out. This isn't kind of an all or nothing scenario. It will be still state right. And it's really nice to compare it to an industry like beverage alcohol. So we get asked a lot, hey, when am I going to be able to walk into a 7-Eleven and buy cannabis? And I like to bring up the fact that I think only 2 years ago, we were allowed to buy real beer in grocery stores in Colorado, one of the largest. So just don't forget where state by state regulations of alcohol stand today and how different those are and how regulated that industry is. And then look at this industry and say, we're not going to see these changes overnight. We might not even see these major changes in the next decade. It is going to be still a difficult, complicated market that has challenges to scale. And that's not going to go away overnight. Which is why obviously a lot of the alcohol, tobacco, Canadian LPs, as well as obviously the largest players in the US are kind of placing bets on where does this go and what does this look like, and where should you put investments today based on where we think the market will be in the next 5 years.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think sometimes, to your point about beer in Colorado, I often remind people we talked to about, cannabis investing, that, alcohol is still very complicated itself. It feels like it's ubiquitous, but on the same note, we still have dry counties today I think there's always going to be counties, towns, whatnot, that are never going to legalize cannabis for whatever reason. Then, but at one point, state by state, all 50 states will have some form of legalization. There's some states stay medical for a little longer than others, sure. But far and away, I think we're seeing that what the people want is medical and rec.
And I know you're in Illinois, so I always make jokes, not that I should publicly, but I was born and raised in Indiana. And so, you look at the state of Indiana and you're like, okay, they've got Illinois bordering them now. They have Michigan bordering them. Ohio is set up to be a pretty big market as well. And you look at some of the border stores in those states and how well they're performing at those border towns, connected to the market. It's only a matter of time before there has to be a shift in thinking of it's accessible right here on the border between Illinois and Indiana. What are you doing in Indiana? So I think there's just, a lot of pressure to my state to make those calls of what is acceptance and what do we set up in terms of an infrastructure.
Right. No, it's certainly an interesting thing. You start to get this geographic pressure, kind of some states on all different sides. I think you're starting to see that.
Well, and it's fun now. 4 years ago, we just had the Wild West and people could kind of disregard it. Like, nope, we've got the Northeast now and the Midwest. Like it's blanketed, it's taking over. So it's definitely good to see that kind of evolution market by market.
For sure. No, I totally agree. And Jess, I know we're kind of towards the end of our time here. So I'll leave you with one last final question. What's your outlook on the next states we can expect to legalize? How do you guys think about that at BDS? And what are the most exciting of those states in terms of business opportunity?
I mean, we can't not talk about New York and New Jersey. Mm-hmm. The hot topics, looking obviously to 2022 and what is that market? How does it open up? Huge opportunity. As we look out 5 years, top US states, and I'm probably not going to get these in the right order off the top of my head. California remains the #1 global legal cannabis market. Really important to instill. California itself is about equivalent to all of Canada. So just to remind people how dominant and important California is to this industry and the size of the legal market, and still a healthy illicit market. Colorado is still a strong market. Really looking at states like Florida to come online and be a huge market opportunity. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, obviously all in connection, but even independently, New York and New Jersey are going to be huge volume drivers in terms of sales in this marketplace. And there's some interesting views also in the Midwest. You have Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, 3 really large states that anticipate to turn on, go legal, and be very large. Obviously, Illinois, Michigan already there, but Pennsylvania driving a lot of interest, specifically around the MSOs and what market evolution looks like. We don't spend a lot of time talking about it, but you can't ignore Texas and just the sheer size of states. It all comes down to, do they accelerate to legalization? Is federal legalization the catalyst for Texas accelerating, or is Texas accelerating a catalyst for federal legalization? We talk about it a lot. Right.
Well, my partner Tibby would certainly be glad to hear that. I suppose however they do it, they'll try to do it as big as they can. So I suppose that's a good thing for the cannabis industry.
Exactly.
Awesome, Jess. Well, thanks a lot for joining us on the podcast. Everyone listening, I hope you enjoyed it. It's been a privilege speaking with you, Jess. And look forward to, you guys should follow Jess on social media. Publishes a lot of great stuff and updates on data and market intelligence in the cannabis space. And we look forward to continuing the conversation, Jess. Thanks.
Thanks, Pete.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.